I used to think my life was enviable. At least, that's what people told me. The neighbors on our suburban street in Westchester always smiled when they saw me pulling into the driveway of our two-story colonial, the one with the manicured hedges and the tasteful shutters painted sage green. "You're so lucky, Claire," they'd say, with that tone that was half admiration, half envy. And I would smile back, play my role, wave politely, and disappear into the house that felt more like a stage set than a home. From the outside, I suppose it looked perfect. Ethan, my husband of 17 years, was a respected financial consultant, always sharply dressed, always punctual. I had my own career at a mid-sized law firm, a respectable income that allowed me to buy the occasional luxury without guilt. And then there were our twin daughters, Lily and Grace, 15 now, both honor students, both beautiful in that unpolished way teenagers can be, sometimes awkward, sometimes radiant. The truth was harder to admit, even to myself. Perfection is exhausting. It's heavy, like carrying around a porcelain mask that can never crack. For years, Ethan and I wore those masks, smiling at PTA meetings, hosting polite dinners, posing for family holiday photos in matching sweaters. But inside our walls, silence grew. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the suffocating kind, the silence of two people who shared a bed yet lived in parallel worlds. Ethan wasn't cruel. He wasn't abusive. In fact, if you asked anyone in our circle, they would describe him as a wonderful husband, reliable, steady, devoted to his work and his family. But that steadiness had long since calcified into distance. He worked late nights, traveled often, and when he was home, he buried himself in spreadsheets, market reports, and endless Zoom calls. I used to wait up for him, back when we were younger, eager just to talk about our days. But somewhere along the line, I stopped waiting. And he stopped noticing that I had. It wasn't one big thing that pushed us apart. It was 1,000 tiny moments, his distracted nods when I tried to tell him about the girls, the way his eyes slid over me as though I were part of the furniture, the obligatory peck on the cheek that passed for intimacy. I told myself it was normal, that this was marriage after so many years. Everyone I knew seemed just as tired, just as resigned. But resignation eats away at you. And for me, it grew into something darker, loneliness. I still remember the first time Adrian Cross paid me real attention. It was nothing dramatic, just a Tuesday afternoon at the firm. He leaned over my desk with that easy smile of his, asking about a case I'd been working on. His questions weren't perfunctory. He listened. Really listened. His eyes held mine in a way Ethan's hadn't in years, like I mattered. I laughed, an unguarded, startled sound that felt foreign in my own mouth. Of course, I told myself it was harmless. Adrian was just a colleague, a man in his early 40s with quick wit and a disarming charm. Married too, though he never spoke much about his wife. Still, the attention was like oxygen to a flame I thought had long gone out. I found myself lingering in the break room, hoping he'd walk in. I caught myself dressing with more care on the mornings I knew we'd be working together. And though I hated the thought, I also loved the way it made me feel, seen, alive, desired. But this isn't where I confess, not yet. This is just the beginning, the first crack in the porcelain mask. That evening, I drove home with a restless energy buzzing beneath my skin. The sun was setting over the neat rows of houses, casting everything in a golden glow that made the world look deceptively perfect. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the house that was supposed to be my safe place. I knew what waited inside. Ethan hunched over his laptop at the dining room table, Lily and Grace upstairs scrolling on their phones, the smell of takeout because no one had the energy to cook anymore. I forced a smile as I walked in, because that's what I did. Smile. Pretend. Maintain the image. "Hey," Ethan said without looking up from his screen. The keys clicked beneath his fingers, relentless. "Hey," I echoed, my voice small. I stood there for a moment, wanting something, eye contact, warmth, anything. But the silence pressed down again, heavier than ever. I turned toward the kitchen, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor, and thought of Adrian's smile, the way his voice had lingered on my name. And in that moment, I knew. Something inside me had already shifted. The perfect life was just a photograph now, fading at the edges. And I was already stepping outside the frame. The law firm wasn't glamorous, though from the outside people assumed it was. Rows of cubicles, the faint smell of burnt coffee, the hum of copy machines, it was as ordinary as any other workplace. Yet lately, it had become the place where I felt most alive, because that was where Adrian was. He wasn't stationed near me, not exactly. His office was across the hall, glass-walled, where I could see him pacing when he took phone calls. He had this way of leaning back in his chair when he listened, arms crossed, a faint smirk curling at the corner of his mouth, as if he were always 2 steps ahead of everyone else. Most of the women in the office noticed him, of course they did, but he noticed me. That was the difference. It began with casual conversations, a quip about the sluggish copier, a sarcastic remark during a staff meeting that only I seemed to catch. But soon it grew into something sharper, more intentional. He remembered the details I mentioned offhand, things Ethan never did. One afternoon, after I complained about how much my daughters loved sushi but hated the way I rolled it at home, Adrian appeared at my desk the next morning with a pamphlet for a sushi-making class in the city. "I thought you might like this," he said casually, as though it were no big deal. But it was a big deal. It was proof that someone was listening. I laughed nervously, tucking the pamphlet into my drawer. "You really don't forget anything, do you?" "Not when it comes to things that matter," he said, holding my gaze just a second too long. That gaze was dangerous. It was the kind of look that saw through me, through the armor I wore every day. For years, I had walked into rooms and blended into the scenery, wife, mother, dependable employee. With Adrian, I wasn't invisible. I was electric. Weeks passed, and the tension grew. We'd linger over lunch breaks, sitting too close at the small cafe across the street. Our knees brushed under the table once, and I swear the touch burned through me. At the firm's holiday gathering, when the room was crowded and noisy, he leaned close to tell me a joke, his breath warm against my ear. My laughter was too loud, too uncontrolled, and I caught the curious look of one of my colleagues. That night, I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror before bed, guilt prickling like heat against my skin. I hadn't crossed the line, not yet, but my heart already knew I was drifting toward it. Ethan was asleep in our bed when I slipped under the covers. He didn't stir, didn't reach for me, didn't notice the storm raging beneath my skin. The first rail crossing came on an ordinary Thursday. We had stayed late, preparing documents for a demanding client. The office was nearly empty, the glow of fluorescent lights casting everything in pale shadow. I was gathering files when Adrian came to stand beside me, his cologne subtle but dizzying in the still air. "You work too hard," he murmured. I smiled, though my hand shook slightly. "Says the man still here at 9 p.m. "That's different," he said softly. "I like staying when you're here." The words froze me, caught somewhere between disbelief and desire. I turned to look at him, and before I could think better of it, he leaned in. It wasn't a rushed kiss, not the kind of impulsive act I could have brushed off. It was deliberate, slow, filled with intent. His lips pressed against mine with a certainty that shattered whatever resistance I had left. I should have stopped him. I should have pulled back, reminded him that we were married, that this was wrong. But instead, I let myself sink into it, into the feeling of being wanted. My body betrayed me, answering a call I had buried for years. When we finally broke apart, breathless, I whispered, "We can't," though my voice lacked conviction. "We already did," he said with that same dangerous smile. On the drive home, my heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every streetlight seemed to glare down at me, exposing me for what I had done. Yet beneath the guilt, there was something else, an exhilaration I couldn't deny. For the first time in years, I felt alive. I walked into the house, where the television buzzed in the living room and the girls laughed upstairs. Ethan sat in his usual spot, laptop open, glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose. He glanced up briefly, long day?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, forcing a calm I didn't feel. "Just work." And then he returned to his screen, and I realized with a sick twist in my stomach how easily I could lie. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought of Adrian's lips, his voice, the heat of his hand against mine. And I thought of Ethan, sleeping only inches away but already 1,000 miles apart. The line had been crossed. And there was no going back. The morning after it happened, I told myself it would never happen again. That it had been a mistake, one born of exhaustion and loneliness, and that I would bury it deep enough to forget. I kissed the girls goodbye before school, packed Ethan's travel mug with black coffee, and pretended nothing inside me had shifted. But pretending is harder than it sounds. The problem wasn't just Adrian. The problem was how I felt when I was near him, and how impossible it was to erase that feeling once I had tasted it. At work, I tried to avoid his office, to keep my eyes on my computer screen. But then he'd pass by with that half-smile, or brush his hand against mine when he leaned over to point at a file, and I'd feel the ground tilt beneath me. The guilt was sharp, but the pull was stronger. At home, the walls seemed to close in. Ethan noticed nothing, at least not directly. He was still buried in reports and late-night calls with clients overseas. Yet his presence had begun to feel different. Quieter, watchful in a way I couldn't quite place. One night, as I folded laundry in the bedroom, he stood in the doorway watching me. "You've been working late a lot," he said. His voice was even, but there was a weight in it that made my stomach twist. I kept my eyes on the sweater in my hands. "We have a new client." "Demanding one. You know how it is." He nodded, slowly. "I do." That was all. He turned and walked away, but the silence he left behind was louder than any accusation. The girls, too, seemed to sense the shift, though they couldn't name it. Lily had grown more sarcastic lately, her teenage armor sharpening by the day. Grace, the quieter one, watched me with those wide eyes of hers, as if she could see straight through me. One evening, when Ethan was still at the office, she asked, "Mom, are you okay? You've been different." I forced a smile. "Just tired, sweetheart. Work's been a lot." She nodded, but her gaze lingered, unblinking, until I had to look away. The cracks were spreading. I could feel them. At the firm, Adrian was relentless in his subtle pursuit. He didn't pressure me, not exactly, but he knew how to position himself just close enough, how to slip compliments into casual conversation that lingered long after. And despite my guilt, I let him. I told myself it was harmless, that no one had to know. But the more I clung to that lie, the heavier it became. One Friday evening, I arrived home later than usual, the chill of autumn clinging to my coat. Ethan was sitting at the dining room table, not with his laptop but with a glass of scotch in front of him. His eyes tracked me as I set down my bag. "Another late night?" he asked. "Yes. Sorry." Don't," he cut in, his voice calm but edged. "You don't need to explain." The words froze me in place. He didn't say more, didn't accuse, didn't press. But the air between us was charged, brittle, as though the truth hovered there, just out of reach. I went to bed that night with my heart pounding, the sheets cold against my skin. Ethan slipped in hours later, lying beside me in silence. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if he knew. By the end of the month, the pretense was unbearable. Every lie I told was another weight on my chest. Every glance from Ethan felt like scrutiny, though he said nothing. I started noticing the way his eyes lingered on me longer than before, the subtle questions in his expression. And then, one morning, it was no longer subtle. I came downstairs to find him already at the table, a folded envelope placed neatly in front of him. The girls had already left for school. His laptop was closed, his phone face down. He looked at me with a steadiness that rooted me to the spot. "What's this?" I asked, my voice catching as I picked up the envelope. "Read it," he said simply. My hands trembled as I slid out the papers inside. Legal documents. Divorce papers. My breath caught in my throat. I can't do this anymore, Claire, Ethan said, his voice quiet but unflinching. I know. Maybe not all the details, but enough. And I'm done pretending. The room seemed to tilt, the floor dropping out beneath me. My chest tightened, and the air turned sharp in my lungs. Ethan? No, he interrupted. Don't. Not now. I don't want excuses. I don't want lies. This is where it ends. For a long time I just stood there, clutching the papers, my vision blurring with tears I refused to let fall. The weight of every secret, every stolen moment, every lie pressed down all at once. The mask had shattered. The fractures could no longer be hidden. I sat at the dining room table with the papers spread out before me like some cruel puzzle I couldn't piece together. The legal language blurred as my eyes burned, the weight of the signature lines pressing against my chest like a brand. Divorce. The word felt alien even though it was now my reality. Ethan hadn't left the house after handing me the envelope. He was in the living room, Scotch glass half empty, staring at nothing. The silence stretched between us, brittle, suffocating. For years we had lived in silence, but this one was different, it was final, edged with the sharpness of endings. Finally, I stood and walked toward him, clutching the papers in my hand. Why now? I asked, my voice shaking. Why like this? You don't even want to talk? He turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. Talk? Claire, we stopped talking a long time ago. The words stung because they were true. I sat down across from him, my hands twisting in my lap. But to just give up? After everything? Don't I even get a chance to explain? His eyes flickered with something, anger, maybe pain. Explain what? That you've been sneaking around? That you've been lying to me, to the girls? Do you think I haven't noticed the late nights, the sudden excuses? I swallowed hard. My mouth went dry. So you do know. He let out a bitter laugh. Not every detail. I don't want to. But I know enough. My heart sank. I had always imagined if he found out, there would be yelling, maybe slammed doors, maybe a fight that tore the walls down. But this quiet certainty was worse. It left no room for denial, no room for begging. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. But don't fool yourself into thinking this is all about you. I froze. What do you mean? He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time in months I saw the exhaustion in his eyes. You think I haven't been unhappy? You think you're the only one who's felt invisible in this marriage? The words hit me like a slap. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. There's someone at my firm, he continued. A woman. We worked late together, traveled together. She made me laugh, made me feel seen. And for a while, I thought about it. I thought about crossing that line. My stomach twisted. Did you? No, his answer was immediate, firm. I didn't. But don't think I didn't want to. The only difference between us, Claire, is that I stopped myself. You didn't. I felt the blood drain from my face. My fingers trembled against the armrest of the chair. The truth was unbearable, not just that he knew about me, but that he had stood on the very same cliff's edge. The gap between us was suddenly smaller, yet impossibly wide. I wanted to believe we could fix this, Ethan said, his voice softer now, though no less steady. But watching you pull away, watching you choose someone else, it told me everything I needed to know. We've both been gone for a long time. You just left first. Tears slipped down my cheeks before I could stop them. Ethan, I'm sorry. Don't, he interrupted, his jaw tightening. Apologies won't fix what's broken. Not this time. The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting match could have been. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the muffled laughter of the girls upstairs, blissfully unaware that their world was about to implode. I wanted to fight for us. I wanted to scream, to beg, to promise I could do better. But deep down, I knew the truth, he had already made up his mind. The papers weren't a threat or a plea for attention. They were a decision. Later that night, when the girls were asleep, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom and watched him pack a small overnight bag. He moved with quiet efficiency, as if he had rehearsed this moment. "Where will you go?" I asked. "A hotel for now," he replied. "I'll figure the rest out later." I stepped into the room, my voice breaking. "And the girls?" His shoulders stiffened. "We'll tell them soon. Together. But not tonight." I wanted to reach out, to touch his arm, to make him look at me one last time as he used to. But he kept his back to me, zipping up the bag. When he finally turned, his eyes were resolute. "This marriage is over, Claire," he said quietly. "I can't live in the shadow of what we used to be. And I won't share you with someone else." The words echoed long after he left the room. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty space where his suitcase had been, the imprint of our life together collapsing in on itself. It wasn't just the affair that had ended us. It was the silence, the years of drifting, the thousand tiny fractures that no one wanted to name. He hadn't been the husband I needed. And I hadn't been the wife he deserved. But now, with the papers staring up at me from the table downstairs, I understood one thing with searing clarity: there was no undoing what I had done. The line was permanent, the damage irreversible. And tomorrow, the truth would begin to spill into the lives of our daughters. The hardest part wasn't signing the papers. It wasn't watching Ethan pack a bag or listening to the quiet finality in his voice. The hardest part was pretending, day after day, in front of Lily and Grace. We didn't tell them right away. Ethan and I agreed, if agree is even the right word anymore, that we'd wait until the end of the school week. He thought it would give them time to process before facing their classmates. I thought it was just delaying the inevitable. Still, every morning I watched them leave the house with backpacks slung over their shoulders, their laughter echoing down the driveway, and I wondered how much longer I could keep lying. Grace lingered by the door more often, her eyes narrowing on me as though she was gathering evidence. Lily rolled her eyes more than usual, her sarcasm sharper, her questions edged with suspicion. At dinner one evening, Lily stabbed at her pasta and said, "Why does Dad keep staying at hotels? You two fighting or something?" My fork froze halfway to my mouth. "He's been busy with work," I said carefully. She arched an eyebrow. "Work that requires not coming home for 3 nights in a row?" Grace set down her glass of water, her gaze fixed on me. "Mom, what's going on?" I wanted to tell them the truth. I wanted to confess, to rip the bandage off and let the wound bleed. But the words lodged in my throat. "We'll talk about it soon," I said. "Together. With your father." Neither of them looked convinced. By Thursday, the truth began leaking in ways I couldn't control. I was in the kitchen scrolling through emails when Grace came storming down the stairs, her face pale, her phone clutched in her hand. "Is it true?" she demanded. My heart plummeted. "What are you talking about?" She thrust the phone at me. A message thread from one of her friends. Rumors at school. Whispers that Mrs. Donovan had been seen with someone from her office. That their parents were splitting up because of me. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Grace." Her eyes filled with tears. "So it's true? You cheated?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. How could I deny it when the guilt was carved into my skin, into every nervous glance and late-night excuse? Lily appeared in the doorway, her expression hard, as if she had already pieced it together. "Unbelievable," she muttered, retreating back upstairs. I reached for Grace, but she pulled away. "I looked up to you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "And now? I don't even know who you are." When she fled upstairs, I was left standing alone in the kitchen, shaking, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. That night, I called Adrian. I needed comfort, someone who still made me feel wanted, even if everything else was collapsing. His voice was warm at first, familiar, and I felt the tension ease slightly, until a woman's voice echoed faintly in the background. "Who's that?" I asked sharply. There was a pause. "Just, my wife," Adrian admitted, the words rushed, almost defensive. My breath caught. "Your wife? I thought you knew," he said, his tone shifting from guilty to cold practicality. "Claire, I never promised." I hung up before he could finish. The room spun around me. My legs gave out and I sank onto the couch, my chest heaving as realization crashed over me. I had destroyed my marriage, fractured my daughter's trust, and for what? For a man who had only been looking for an escape of his own. A man who had never intended to stay. In that moment, the affair didn't feel like passion or salvation. It felt like ashes in my mouth. Later, when I walked past Lily's room, I heard her crying softly, though she quickly muffled it when she realized I was outside. Grace wouldn't even look at me. The house that once felt too quiet was now filled with a different kind of silence, one edged with disappointment, betrayal, and grief. I closed myself in the bathroom and stared at my reflection. The woman in the mirror was a stranger. Her eyes were hollow, her lips pressed tight, her skin drawn pale with shame. I pressed my hands against the counter, forcing myself to face her. This was the price of betrayal, not just the end of a marriage, but the loss of the people who once saw me as steady, safe, dependable. My daughters, my husband, my family. And all because I wanted to feel alive again. The day I told them was the day I stopped running from myself. I gathered Lily and Grace in the living room on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The autumn light slanted through the blinds, striping the floor in pale gold. Ethan wasn't there, he'd moved into a townhouse across town the week before. The house already felt emptier without him, though his absence was not the kind of silence I had once dreaded. This silence was sharper, defined by absence, by a void that no amount of pretending could fill. The girls sat across from me, their faces guarded. Lily's arms were crossed, her chin tilted in defiance. Grace clutched a pillow to her chest, her eyes downcast. I had rehearsed the words 100 times in my head, but when the moment came, my throat tightened. "I need to tell you the truth," I began, my voice breaking. "About me. About why your father and I ended." Neither of them spoke. I took a breath and forced myself to continue. "I made mistakes. Big ones. I let myself get lost in things I should never have allowed. I was unfaithful to your dad. And that's why this happened." The words hung heavy in the room. Grace flinched, her lip trembling. Lily's eyes hardened, filling with the kind of fury only a teenager could hold. "I knew it," Lily spat. "Everyone at school knew before you even said anything." "Lily." "No," she snapped, her voice cracking. "You were supposed to be better than this. You were supposed to be." "Mom." Her words cut deeper than anything Ethan had said. Grace buried her face in the pillow, muffling a sob. I wanted to reach out, to hold them, but I stayed where I was. They deserved the space to hate me. They deserved the truth, even if it broke us further apart. "I can't undo what I did," I whispered. "But I can be honest from now on. You don't have to forgive me. Not now, maybe not ever. But I won't lie to you again." The room was thick with silence. Eventually, Lily stormed upstairs, her footsteps pounding like thunder. Grace lingered a moment longer, then looked at me with tear-filled eyes. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why wasn't our family enough for you?" My chest caved in at her words. "It wasn't about you," I said, tears streaming freely now. "It was me. I was lost. I wanted to feel something I thought I'd lost forever. But it wasn't worth this. None of it was." She shook her head and left me there, alone on the couch with my shame. The weeks that followed were the loneliest of my life. Neighbors stopped waving when I drove past. Invitations to gatherings dried up. At the firm, whispers trailed behind me, and Adrian avoided me entirely, as if I were a stain he couldn't scrub from his reputation. It was ironic, the man I had risked everything for could vanish so easily, while the people I loved were the ones left shattered. But somewhere in that isolation, a shift began. For the first time in years, I sat with myself. No masks. No pretending. Just me, my guilt, and the mirror I had avoided for too long. One night, unable to sleep, I opened my laptop and began to write. Not emails, not case notes, just words. Memories. Confessions. Pages of everything I had done and everything I had lost. It wasn't for anyone else, not at first. It was just for me, a way to face the wreckage without turning away. As the weeks turned into months, the writing became a ritual. I filled journals, then files on my computer. I wrote about the silence of my marriage, the loneliness that drove me, the fire that burned too quickly and left only smoke. I wrote about Ethan's quiet strength, about Lily's fire and Grace's gentleness, about the kind of love I had taken for granted until it was gone. Slowly, the act of telling the truth, if only on paper, became its own form of survival. I don't know if my daughters will ever forgive me. Lily avoids me more often than not, though sometimes I catch her glancing at me when she thinks I'm not looking, her expression softening for a fraction of a second. Grace still sits with me sometimes in the kitchen, silent but present, and I cling to those moments like lifelines. As for Ethan, our conversations are brief, logistical. Custody schedules, bills, school events. He no longer looks at me with anger. Just distance. And maybe that's worse. But here, in the ruins of the life I once called perfect, I've begun to understand something. The affair didn't make me alive. It didn't save me from loneliness. It only stripped away the illusions I had built, forcing me to face the hollow places I had ignored. Now, for the first time in years, I am facing them. I don't know what comes next. Maybe redemption is impossible. Maybe forgiveness will never arrive. But as I close my journal tonight, the words etched across the page feel like the first honest thing I've said in a very long time. I destroyed the life I had. But from these ashes, I will build something new, this time without lies.